Good evening, everyone, for those of you based in Australia, and welcome to panel W7.2 on the politics of aid and solidarity. This evening, which is the final session for day one of the conference, we have four panelists and presentations. But before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners of the land on which the Centre for Humanitarian Leadership is located and on which we work. I wish to formally recognise the elders, families and forebears of the Wurundjeri people and acknowledge that they are the traditional custodians of the land and have been so for millennia. I'd also like to acknowledge that the land on which we live is stolen land. The Wurundjeri people have never ceded their sovereignty, and these lands and treaties are yet to be negotiated. We additionally acknowledge the Wurundjeri peoples and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples' living cultures, knowledges, and struggles in the region. I think that probably sets the scene very well for this panel in terms of beginning to talk about the politics of aid and solidarity. So I will move directly on to the papers and our five speakers for today. In terms of how this panel will run, I will introduce each speaker and their paper in turn, and then they will have up to 15 minutes to present, followed by 5 minutes for question and answers, which I will moderate. Please, in the audience, use the question and answer function on the platform and chat function, since it is not possible to hand over the microphone for these two audience members. Once all four papers have been presented, we will give the panelists 10 minutes for their responses and discussion, and then there will be a final 10 minutes of question and answers, again, moderated by myself before we close. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, Dr. Tamam Adolat, who is presenting a paper entitled Decolonizing Humanitarianism, Challenging the Roots. Tamam is a senior strategic advisor for Médecins Sans Frontières Access Campaign and a medical doctor and public health expert. He has worked with the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement and for Médecins Sans Frontières in the field and headquarters directly supporting emergency medical assistance in multiple contexts. Tamam holds a medical degree from the University of Damascus and a master's degree in public health in developing countries from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Tamam, thank you for being on our panel today, and I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. As mentioned, the presentation today about decolonizing humanitarianism, revisiting the roots. I will start today by quoting Bell Hooks, an icon of Black feminism, who, talking about her own journey, said, "Simply being a victim of an exploitative or oppressive system and even resisting it does not mean we understand why it's in place or how to change it." Creating rudiments of such understanding of the humanitarian system that goes beyond the surface is the purpose of this paper. While Hooks was talking about sexism in the 70s United States, and I talk here about the coloniality and the asymmetries of power in the humanitarian system, the parallels are unmistakable. After all, the system that Hooks calls the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy is implicated in both phenomena. Similarly, I will argue later in the presentation that her call for critical consciousness as means towards emancipation can be seen as one of the ways forward in the humanitarian sector. The coloniality of the humanitarian sector and the need to decolonize it have become a topic difficult to ignore for humanitarian organizations, practitioners, academics, and donors on both sides of the argument. This is particularly the case as the social movements amplified in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd in the United States last year and the ensuing burst of action by Black Lives Matter activists spread globally, as well as the faltering of solidarity and equity in the management of COVID-19 on one of the biggest health crises of our time. The decolonizing debate inherited from recent movements such as Rhodes Must Fall, the Decolonize the University, and similar emerging debates in other related fields such as global health has resulted in mixed reactions by humanitarian actors in the global north. ranging from denial and defensiveness to acknowledgement and promises of change. Yet neither position has yet interrogated their own understanding of the terms, coloniality and decolonization, and their reasons to embrace or reject it. The debate, currently more effective than evidentiary, will benefit from more exploration, definition, and even theorizing that lays the groundwork for understanding and praxis. To do so, I will start by attempting a definition of coloniality and decolonizing as they relate to humanitarianism. Colonialism was defined by Horvath in 1971 as a form of domination by individuals or groups over the territory and or the behavior of other individuals of groups, with emphasis on either the economic or cultural processes. I find this definition useful insofar as it emphasizes the act of domination, the cultural, economic, and social part of it, as opposed to the exclusive military conquest or settlement. To define decolonization in this context, I will quote Bambra and colleagues in their 2018 book, Decolonizing the University. She says, decolonizing has two key references. First, it is a way of thinking about the world which takes colonialism, empire, and racism as its empirical and discursive objects of study. It resituates these phenomena as they shape forces of the contemporary world in context where their role has been systematically effaced from view. Second, it purports to offer alternative ways of thinking about the world and alternative norms of political praxis. To address coloniality and humanitarianism, it is necessary to examine the foundational elements beyond current supremacy in practice and language, while addressing structural racism as in the discrimination practiced in the dichotomies of Western versus local actors, expatriate versus national staff, and humanitarians versus beneficiaries is necessary and urgent, following the discourse of diversity and inclusion through human resources policies is unlikely to rectify the power imbalances in the heart of the discussion. Here, I will make a few assumptions. First, that decolonizing humanitarianism still acknowledges the need and value of providing humanitarian assistance and rejects views that call for the immediate and unmediated dismantling of such system. That forms and functions of humanitarianism, particularly deunantist humanitarian organizations, as categorized by Stoddard in 2003, are in constant flux and are hence capable of conscientious self-examination and change. That while all efforts should continue to focus on the effectiveness and efficiency of humanitarian aid, there is value in eliminating structural racism and other forms of supremacy, regardless to whether this increases aid effectiveness or not. That confronting power asymmetries and the resulting supremacy and discrimination cannot happen through managing their symptoms without understanding the underlying perceptions, values, practices, and structures and addressing them. And finally, that decolonizing action cannot take place in separation from other forms of supremacy, discrimination, and that coloniality and structural racism overlap with and are enforced by sexism, misogyny, homophobia, ableism, ageism, ethno and Eurocentrism, among other forces. Hence, an intersectional approach to decolonizing is implicit. First, I will talk about the mythology and ideology that underlines our discussion. It is tempting to situate modern humanitarianism in decontextualized myths that show linear history of the present. These origin stories will emphasize the Genevan merchant, Henri Dunant, helping wounded soldiers in the aftermath of the Battle of Solferino, while neglecting to mention that he was there to pursue his business interests in colonial Algeria. They will also tell of the French doctors who, fed up with the complacency and silence of the ICRC in the Biafra War, initiated the sans-frontierism movement while leaving out what Eleanor Davie described as this being a consequence of their disillusionment with the Marxist project of Europe. The historicization of humanitarianism is not a way of discrediting it or its intention, but one that situates it in the context and influences of its time and place. This is particularly important when such ahistoric descriptions of humanitarianism allow it to claim timeless values that are incontestable. Such historicization can view current shape and form relationships in terms of their suitability for our context. This would follow on the footsteps of historians, theorists, and anthropologists of humanitarianism, such as Barnett, Fassin, Tecton, Agier, Bornstein, and Redfield, among others. But it would also take their findings and examine them from the post-colonial concepts and work of Fanon, Césaire, Said, Spivak, the Subaltern Studies Group, and Baba, among others. On rereading the principles, the humanitarian principles as written by the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement in 1965 and asserted in the 1991 UN General Assembly resolution remain one of the bastions of humanitarianism, one that is widely agreed despite the changes in crisis, humanitarian structures, and world politics. Along with the international humanitarian law, they form the basis on which humanitarian action can still function, especially in armed conflicts. However, the interpretation of the words vary. One of the obvious contestations on the principles is that of neutrality, which has lost credence in humanitarian sector outside the ICRC over the past decades, to the extent that one of the prominent scholars of humanitarianism, Hugo Slim, recently decried that you don't need to be neutral to be a good humanitarian. However, humanity as the foundational principle has rarely been contested. After all, this common attribute that gathers the rich and poor is the apparent justification and source of humanitarianism. It is specifically here that I would like to anchor this discussion. The first question is, whose humanity? While a common sense reading of the principle will imply that common humanity of all obliges the privilege to help the suffering, this conception does not give any rights to the victims of crisis, nor provides a framework for allocating attention, resources, or humanitarian obligation beyond the goodwill of the humanitarian actor. This can be traced to the commentary on humanitarian principles authored by Jean Pictet of the ICRC in 1979, where he states that humanity, therefore, the sentiment or attitude someone who shows himself to be human, and follows by defining humanity as a sentiment of active goodwill towards mankind. While Pictet doesn't deny the humanity of the victims of disasters, his description is one that focuses on the humanity of the giver rather than the receiver. This, I would argue, is still the conception today. As such, language still dominates our discourse. This results in distinction, even opposition, between those who possess the active will and sovereignty, and or those are the humanitarians, and those whose humanity is only defined by their bare life, by their victimhood, vulnerability, and lack of agency, our beneficiaries. The absolute victim, the result from such conceptions has been examined by, among others, Agier in 2010, who perhaps not accidentally has elsewhere described humanitarianism as the left hand of the empire. The argument above is neither about revoking the humanitarian principles nor the system they propel. After all, those principles still inform, inspire, and guide humanitarian practitioners as they do their work, providing life-saving aid to millions of people who would otherwise succumb to the effects of crisis. Particularly, humanity as a principle, despite its ambiguity, has been found in a review by Boussard and colleagues in 2019 to intersect with the will to provide the highest possible quality of care to people humanitarianism serves. In their position as moral principles, humanity and impartiality serve as the moral compass of humanitarian action. For this moral compass to work, however, interpreting and understanding the humanitarian principles should not be done exclusively in think tanks and headquarters of an ever-expanding and competing humanitarian environment. A wider net should be cast, and serious debate should include not only local humanitarian actors, but also communities in humanitarian contexts. So the question is how to decolonize. The discussion about decolonization will necessarily go beyond organizational diversity and inclusion efforts, while human resources policies that eliminate barriers to inclusion of women, people of color, indigenous people, and other minorities in governance and decision-making are necessary and still far from common. They are not alone going to change the power hierarchies that are constitutive of the coloniality of humanitarianism. For that to happen, a re-examination of the humanitarian discourse should take place side by side with the debates on its location, financing, and governance. This is particularly relevant as COVID-19 shows the failures of global solidarity rhetoric. And as we look to a future that will bring the humanitarian consequences of climate crisis, changes in disease endemicity, failures of crops and hunger, severe weather events, mass displacement, and rising sea levels make traditional mission-based humanitarianism impractical or impossible. A method for such examination can be opening the space for a collective development of the critical consciousness Paulo Freire suggests in his Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This goes far beyond sloganism of localization and accountability to beneficiaries, which is still subject to the whims of donors and headquarters, and treats people affected by calamities as subjects with autonomy rather than objects acted upon by the humanitarian system. In doing so, a decolonizing discourse gives rich history, context, and vocabulary that will allow humanitarianism the opportunity to move away from being perceived as the left hand of the empire or a tool of the current hegemonic system, and into being an emancipatory force for the people it serves. Thank you very much.